So this fireplace mantle is very, very rich in history. We were speaking earlier of the milk giver icon of the Mother of God. So here is a photograph of the children in the orphanage gazing reverently at the milk giver icon. No, it's not a complete, no, it's in Shanghai. So I'll simply have everyone pass it along once you've had a chance to examine it thoroughly.
These two still alive?
That I do not know, Father. I'm not sure one way or another. While they were trying to get out of Shanghai, there was one layman, a gentleman named Victor Bolokov, I think his name was. You'll read about him in that book, Exodus. St. John Maximovich leads his flock out of Shanghai. Here is a photograph of Victor and St. John in the Philippines. And you can see the tents where the people resided. They're all in line for something. I don't know, maybe it's hot water being heated by wood, a fire. So he was the main layman, and St. John was the main cleric that gave the exodus of the flock its direction.
He's smiling.
Yeah. Now, I have to tell all of you an interesting story that I heard from one of the people who was part of that exodus. This was over a lunch at a facility where we had a lot of pilgrims that day. And he told a very interesting story. There were questions about where they would go when they would flee from Shanghai. There was a decree that said China is only for the Chinese, so the French returned to France and the Germans returned to Germany. They all lived in what was known as the French concession of Shanghai, which was where most of the foreigners were. And it turned out that the Soviet government was trying to woo the White Russians back to the Soviet Union. Oh, come back to the homeland, we'll take care of you, this kind of thing. Well, I'm sure you will not be surprised to know that most people doubted the truth of this invitation. So 2 people volunteered to go back and to test the waters. Now, how would they communicate whether the conditions were acceptable or not? They devised a brilliant code. And the code was this: if the conditions are good, send a photograph and stand. If the conditions are bad, send a photograph and sit. Now, I once had some military people here who were catechumens, preparing to become Orthodox. They're also very high up in military intelligence in the United States Army. And I made the assertion to them that the Orthodox Church has more sophisticated code than the United States military. And they looked at me rather strangely, like, what manner of assertion is this priest giving us? And I said, we actually put you military guys to shame. And I said, tell me if you could figure this out. So I explained to them what I just explained to you. And they looked at each other and they said, Father, no one would ever suspect a photograph as being some kind of indication for it's good or it's not good. If you write a letter, they'll just simply throw it in the garbage. However, the photographs came through, but they were not standing and they were not sitting. So, does anyone have an idea what their body posture was if they weren't standing and they weren't sitting?
Kneeling? They were kneeling?
No, but you're getting close. They were not kneeling.
Prostrated?
Close. They were actually lying down on their side with their head in the palm of their hand, looking like they're having the time of their life. But what it meant was, if we're not sitting and we're lying on the ground, it meant it's so bad, don't even think about it. So they said, well, let's go where the communists would not want to follow us, is what the story said. So they went to this island in the Philippines where there were a lot of hurricanes. And during the time that St. John was there, he would walk around the island with the cross and bless the four directions. And the hurricanes went around the island. 2 days after the last Orthodox Christian left that island, a massive hurricane blew through it and smashed that displaced person's camp to the ground. So it's a pretty amazing story to read about St. John and the flock coming here. And that photograph of Victor and St. John on the island, this picture's worth 2,000 words, not just 1,000. How many of you are familiar with this photograph? Almost everyone has seen this photograph of St. John smiling, that beautiful smile. He was looking at his orphan children in this photograph, which is why he has this beautiful smile. Now, if I'm working for the newspaper, of which Father Vesselin is the chief editor, and Father Vesselin as chief editor says, Father James, please compose a draft caption for the title of this photograph. I would say, well, Reverend Father, I think I would write, quote, I was his favorite, unquote, underneath that. Because anyone who looks at you with that much love makes you feel like you are the most favored person on planet Earth. Now, when I was first ordained a priest 13 years ago, at my first Pascha, after we celebrated the Vespers of Love on Sunday at noon at the new cathedral after all the midnight Pascha services were over, we then broke out into visiting people's homes and having all of those wonderful Easter treats that will have you looking up your local diet clinic for the next month or two after eating enough of them, right? Pascha, kulich, all those wonderful tasty things. So I sat at the table where 3 of St. John's orphans were seated, 2 on my right and 1 on my left. And I asked them, tell me what it was like in the orphanage. And they said that when St. John, because he hardly ever slept, when they would go to sleep, he would tiptoe in the dorm and he would make sure that each child was properly covered, that their pillow was adjusted, and he would bless each child in each bed. He was nicknamed the Black Ghost because he would sneak in because he hardly slept. And they would try to stay up till he came by and blessed them. So when all the stories were done, the woman on my right whispers in my ear, I guess whispers ostensibly to conceal the contents of her assertion from her fellow orphanage alumni. And she whispers to me, I was his favorite. The one directly across from her on my left heard what she had to say, and she knitted her eyebrows. She said, you were not. I was his favorite. And the lady, one person down the table from the woman immediately on my right, rose up in her chair and looking rather snootily down her nose at her 2 alumni, she said, I hate to disappoint the 2 of you, but he personally told me I was his favorite. So I just dismiss this as the competition of young people to be numero uno with St. John. So 2 years later, I fly to Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'm visiting the home of a Greek family that had been in this room 6 months before I got there. They were here in SF. I told the parents and the kids the story, and the mom and dad looked at me and said, Father, when we were in St. Tikhon's, we met the woman who said, he personally told me I was his favorite. I said, how did you meet her? They said, well, when we were in this room, she walked into this room, she pointed to this photograph, and she said, I was raised by him. So they said, tell us what it was like. So she said the orphanage was a wonderful place, but because she didn't have a regular family, Because sometimes the parents who were targeted for assassination, for political purposes, left their children with St. John, and then they fled. So she said, because I didn't have a regular family, I suffered from sorrow and sadness. So she said, in order to resolve my sorrow and sadness, I decided to reinvent my person, to reinvent myself. She was like 8 years old. And she said, I decided I would become a new person, and if I became a new person, I would have no history to be depressed about. That's how she resolved to fix her problem at the age of 8. So she went up to St. John and she said, Vladika, I'm no longer going to be Valentina. And he looked at her and he said, now Valya, we have to pray about that. After liturgy tomorrow, you come see me and we'll have a talk. So they prayed a long time. At the end of the prayer, he got up and blessed her, said, you and I will have a talk tomorrow. The following day, he sits down with her after liturgy and says, you know, Valentina, I'm a busy man as a bishop. And he listed his daily duties, one after the other, that he has to attend to every day. And he said, do you know what the duty that I like the most happens to be in the midst of all of the tasks I have to do every day? She said, what's that, Vladika? And he said, it's when I visit my orphans here at the orphanage. And of all my orphan children, you are my favorite. But now what am I going to do if my favorite little Valentina has become a new person? I don't even know. I'm going to be very sad. Would you be the reason to make me very sad, Valentina? Oh, no, Vladika, she said. He said, then please, for my sake, would you stay, Valentina? She said, for you, Vladika. Okay. And you could tell how he took all the sorrow out of her heart that day and in every other temptation she had on the sea of life. So I get back to San Francisco after my trip. 2 months later, it's the feast day of the parish where this girl, little girl then, a distinguished grandparent now, attends. It's the All-Russian Saints Parish in Burlingame. And, hold on a second. Christos Voskres. Come in. What do you have? You have something for delivery?
This is a concept, and it's a very,
Rabchenko.
yeah.
Yeah, just leave it on the, wherever you want to, you just put it wherever you need to.
Okay.
I have no clue. Okay. I have no clue. So we're at the trapeza, and I'm seated with Valentina, and I told her what happened to me in Canada, and I reminded her of how we first met, and how she and her other alumni from the orphanage were competing for the status of favorite. And I said, so it really is true. St. John did tell you that you were his favorite. And she says to me, well, of course, he said I was his favorite. And she reached around her neck, pulling up on a chain, a little heart-shaped locket, which she opened. Inside was a photograph of St. John's father, Boris, and his mother, Glafira. And proudly displaying this little heart-shaped locket on the palm of her left hand, she says, St. John personally gave this to me, and all the other orphans are jealous. So, my title for this photograph, I was his favorite. Okay? Now, if you want to see a photograph of Valentina in the year 1938, she is the little girl in this hat right here. Okay? And if you looked at her now, you would recognize her, even though she's in her 80s. That's her. I don't know her last name. Okay. So this is St. John's favorite. Okay. Now, let me point out this lady here. This lady's name is Lydia. She attends this church. Okay? And this little girl right here is her sister. She passed away last year. Lydia and her husband still attend this church. And so here she is, the fourth person from the left. Two days before St. John died, she went in to get a blessing. Now, St. John knew the date of his repose. It had been revealed to him by a saint in a vision. So he stood up to bless her in his cell, which is on the other side of this wall. And he said to her, standing up, as he blessed her, he said, "You remember my words. When I die, you come pray to me, just like you're talking to me now." Now, at the old cathedral, you all saw that I didn't do a single word of my own. Everything that I said in the Moleben came out of the books. When Father and I do services, we don't need to make up our own words, because the best words that could be used are already in the prayers. But you cannot take with you icons and mantillas and icon stands and candle stands and priests and vestments and anointing oils and all that in your daily life. So St. John, through Lydia, gives each one of us an easy way to stay in touch with him. And that is, you talk to him and he will consider that to be a prayer. Now, what does that mean? It means that St. John had the cell phone plan before the cell phones. It's known as the Chokhi plan, or if you're Romanian, the Metania plan, or if you're English speaking, the prayer rope plan. You dial 1 on your prayer rope. That's the area code of heaven, because there's one true God. There are no activation fees, no taxes, no limit on the minutes. There's unlimited data, no roaming charges, no upgrades required, and no drop calls. Okay? It's the prayer rope plan. And this will help you stay in touch with St. John wherever you happen to be. And in that case, he permits you to speak in your own words. Because sometimes we need to do that. We just don't need to do that in public services. But he just indicated to us through her that there is no limit to that in the privacy of one's own prayers. So, other photographs here that are significant. This is a photograph of the orphans 1 year later. And I'll let you all pass this around. I should point out that the lady who is St. John's in the middle, there's a lady here about 4 or 5 people to his left, or to his right, excuse me. This was the head of the orphanage. Maria was her name. And you heard me say in the prayer when I was blessing all of you with the mantilla that St. John appeared to someone and said, "Even though I have died, yet I am alive." That was Maria to whom he appeared. Okay? These are the benefactors of the St. Tikhon's Society and of this building that helped make possible the gift of this building to St. John. And he's having a celebratory dinner with them. And Maria is also featured in that photograph.
No, ladies.
All women. We have to remember, Father, if there's about 10 women in there, that means there's 50 different people, because they can do 5 things at the same time, as opposed to 10 men, which just means 10 things at once.
Not surrounded.
So there's,
and everywhere.
they're all multitaskers. We hapless men of the male species, we have our limits. Anyway, these are the benefactors of the St. Tikhon Society. And they're responsible for the gift of this building to St. John.
Mayberries.
The last photograph that I'll show you on this wall is of this gathering of the bishops of the Russian Church abroad in I think 61 or 62, something like that. And this is significant for a number of reasons. What you see as two of the bishops in the white klobuks this one is Anastasi and this one is Filaret. He had retired and he was just elected as the first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad. But what is perhaps not well known is that there was a series of votes before he was elected, and they were attempting to elect a new first hierarch. And the votes were tied between Archbishop Nikon of Washington, D.C. and St. John. So after I don't know how many ballots, St. John and Archbishop Nikon got together and said, neither of us will be elected. Let's nominate Bishop Filaret of, and I hope I say this right, Brisbane. I would say Brisbane, but I know an Aussie would give me a furrowed eyebrow, so I would say Brisbane. We have a city called Brisbane just down the peninsula. No one there says Brisbane, so I'm safe if I say Brisbane and Brisbane, but not in Australia. So Bishop Filaret of Brisbane was nominated and unanimously elected. And so here he is in this photograph. And any of you who know the history of Metropolitan Filaret of the Russian Church outside Russia know he was a saintly man.
Yeah, it looks so fun.
Yeah, sorry, should pass that around. Aha, Christos Voskresce.
You're back.
You're back. Oh, you still was here, yes? When I couldn't.
Sorry?
You still here, stay here all the time?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. I'm just taking.
Yes, indeed. This theology is wonderful. Now I want to call your attention to something now on this wall. If you will take a look at the three photographs that are here, St. John is talking with this really distinguished looking military general. His name was Albert Wiedermeyer. He worked in China for a number of years, and he is the general that put St. John in contact with Senator Noland, who was the champion of the people coming from the Philippines to the United States. And he's also the military general who drafted the American battle plan against the Germans starting in 1941. So what an interesting coincidence. Here are photographs of St. John's orphans, of St. John with various clergy, and in the middle is a photograph of St. John on the day that he was consecrated a bishop. So that's what he looked like, yes, on the day he was made a bishop. You know, he was reluctant to accept such a thing and complained that he had a speech impediment, and the bishops who were nominating him said, yeah, so did Moses. Present yourself for ordination. You know, he couldn't get out of it.
Is that the mantia that we do?
It's a very good question, Elena. The mantia that he's wearing there is not the mantia at the old cathedral. It's one of the ones he had, but that one was all cut up and given to his orphans. Yes, Father?
Apparently, he was going to a nomination or ordination, and somebody said, some lady stopped him on the bus, and he said somebody's about to be a bishop.
Yes.
And he's going to Belgrade from wherever he was at the seminary with St. Euston.
Yeah.
And then later she said, please tell me who that is. And then he said, oh, it's bad news, it's me. It's, oh, later on. He didn't even know that it was him.
Yes.
I don't know if you heard that story.
Yes.
Something like that. Tell us. So
Yeah, it's the same. It's exactly correct, Father. It was, some of these things are hard to escape sometimes. The last thing I'll show you in this room, and then we'll go to see the cell. You've all been to the relics and you've seen what St. John, the beautiful reliquary that he is underneath. Well, this reliquary that is in this photograph next to this window is the reliquary of his great-great-great uncle, St. John of Tobolsk, after whom he was named as a monk. So at the new cathedral, in the middle is St. John holding the new cathedral in his left hand and blessing with his right. On the right frame is the man in blue, in the blue mantilla, St. John of Tobolsk. And at the new cathedral, in the left panel, is the Archangel Michael, because he was baptized Michael and then tonsured John after his great-great-great uncle, who incidentally was the first Russian bishop to start a mission to China. What a interesting connection. So I want to tell all of you a fascinating story of something that happened at the relics of the new cathedral. So you can use that kind of as your visual model. Okay? Have you ever heard of a convert priest from Indonesia named Daniel Biantoro?
I have.
Okay. He was here in San Francisco, and I heard the following from his own lips. Once he went in the city of Jakarta to visit some of his flock in a hospital. And he's walking down the hall, and he goes by this door, and he hears, "Father, Father." So he backs up, he goes in, and there's this woman he's never met, and she says, "I'm really sick. Everywhere below my waist, I'm riddled with cancer. I only have a few weeks to live. I need prayers." He said, "I'll pray for you." She said, "But I'm a Muslim. I'm not Christian." He said, "You ask for prayers, I'll pray for you." So he put his hands on her head, and he began to pray for her and prayed for her a long time. Then he blessed her and he said, "I'll be back in a week to see you." So he goes and visits his other parishioners. A week later, he comes back to the hospital. He goes into her room. She's not there, but her bed is covered in blood. So he doesn't know what to make of it. So he goes and he finds her doctors. And the doctors are very happy. And he says, "What happened to the woman in this room whose bed is covered in blood?" And they said, "She just had a huge eruption of blood, and we just checked her out. And she's cancer-free. She's perfectly healthy. Whatever it was, it's now gone from her body." So she found him, and she said to him, "I want to become a Christian." Well, Indonesia is a very hostile country to Christianity. It's very intensely Muslim. So he said, "Well, I'm flying to San Francisco, and we'll visit the relics of an incorrupt archbishop, and we'll baptize you." So she said, "Can I take my husband?" He said, "Of course." She said, "He's not a believer, and he will be opposed to this." And Father Daniel said, "Well, bring him along anyway, and when we get to San Francisco, we'll leave him alone with St. John." So they fly to San Francisco, and during the flight, the husband is complaining to his wife, "Well, you can be baptized, but I'm not going to be baptized. And you can believe in incorrupt saints, but I don't believe in incorrupt saints." So the whole trip, he's just bellyaching up a storm. They get to the relics, and they're standing in front of the relics. And he's looking at St. John, and he said he had to have been embalmed. And Father Daniel said no, he forbade anyone to embalm him by a written decree. And so there he is making all of these grumpy comments. So Father Daniel nudges the wife and goes like this, saying, "Let's go and stand outside." So they left the cathedral, and they went and they stood on the steps leading into the new cathedral, leaving her husband alone with the saint. So now that he didn't have anyone to perform in front of with all his grumpiness, he says, "Oh God, if this is true, show me a sign." Now he professed not to even be a believer, but here he is in front of the relics praying to God. Now normally in the Orthodox Church we don't look for signs. We take the G out and we look for sins. Because signs looked for without repentance usually bring demons to delude you. But if you repent of the sins that you find, maybe one day you will be given a sign. So, nonetheless, even though that's our good Orthodox advice, this man needed something because his soul was empty and bitter. So what does he see? Well, again, you all remember that in the middle icon of St. John at the new cathedral above the relics, he's holding the church and he's blessing. His klobuk is here and he's wearing his mantilla, and this man is looking at St. John in the face, and St. John's face goes like this. Nods. This man takes a step back. He goes, "Oh God, if that was true, show me another sign." St. John's hands came out of the icon like a bishop, went like this, and went back in. This man turned 180 degrees, and he ran out of the new cathedral, and he's on the front steps leading into the church, and he says to Father Daniel and his wife, "We have to get out of this place. This place is spooky." And Father Daniel said, "You silly goose, this place is not spooky. This place is holy. What did you see?" So the man relates what he saw. And Father Daniel's rubbing his hands together triumphantly, and he says, "So, when may we arrange for you to be baptized?" And it wasn't long after that that this man was baptized, and the two of them, he and his wife, are the pillars of Father Daniel's church in Jakarta, Indonesia. So, wondrous are the ways of the Lord, and wondrous is God in his saints. Yes, Father.
Did you probably do know that Father Daniel's grandfather was Imam, was a Muslim cleric.
I do not know that.
You didn't know this story, didn't tell you.
I know how he was converted,
Yeah.
how Christ appeared to him in
Yes.
the apartment, but I don't know the history of his family.
His
That's
grand-
really something.
Yeah.
Father Daniel is a very intelligent individual. He speaks like 9 or 10 languages, and he's very vivacious and very alive and very jovial and very intense. I hope you all get the pleasure to meet him someday. So now we're going to just go around the